All right, good evening, everybody. If you would, get your Bibles out, open them up to Acts chapter 9. That's where we will be this evening. I am going to actually go back and grab the last couple of verses at the end of chapter 8 and kind of clean up and finish up the remainder of the Philip and the eunuch story. Just a couple of other little tidbits I want to bring out and give you an opportunity to do that as well. But great to have the chance to be together here in the middle of the week. What a wacky 24 hours it's been. Just a little over 24 hours ago, me and Hattie were driving down Oak Hill Road with our windows down. Hattie was hanging out the window, and it's snowing now. So it's Kentucky. What do you expect? So but I'm glad that we're all safely here tonight and have the opportunity to be together. Got folks that are following from afar, and if you've got comments and questions, you make those known throughout the study. Get my attention, and be glad to incorporate those as we work along. And if you've got comments on the chat, drop those in there, and I'll keep an eye down here and make sure we get those incorporated. We did look last week at that great conversion story of the Ethiopian man. And as I said last week, it really is the first in 3 consecutive chapters of just great conversions involving just extremely sincere people. And we just noted several things about the genuineness and the sincerity of the Ethiopian man last week and things that we can learn from that man. I want to just grab those last couple of verses at the end of chapter 8 and make just a couple of additional observations about this man. Chapter 8, verse 38, I think I've still got that here for the screen. Acts 8, verse 38, this is after he's asked about, is there anything that's hindering me from being baptized? And Philip said, nope, if you believe with all your heart, you may. So verse 38, he commanded the chariot to stop, and they both went down into the water, Philip and the eunuch, and he baptized him. And when they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord carried Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more. And he went on his way rejoicing. But Philip found himself at Azotus, and as he passed through, he preached the gospel to all the towns until he came to Caesarea. Just a couple of observations that we did not make last week that I want to draw out from here. Verse 38 is one of those passages that you want to highlight whenever you're having discussions with friends about baptism and what constitutes baptism biblically. There are lots of ideas out there, lots of different forms of baptism that are administered today. It's been that way probably for centuries. But Acts 8, verse 38, I think might be exhibit A for why we want to state emphatically that baptism is immersion. Look at what's happening there. They both went down into the water. There's no reason for Philip to go down into the water if he's just sprinkling a little bit of water on the eunuch's head, or if he's just going to grab a scoop in his hand and just pour that on his head. No reason for Philip to go down in the water. The reason Philip goes down in the water is because he's going down with the man. And I can speak to this when I'm baptizing somebody back there in the baptistry. Oftentimes, folks will notice when I come out of the baptistry, I'm about 75-80% wet as well. That's because I'm going down with them to ensure that they're getting under. This is an immersion that's taking place there. And of course, the word baptizo just means immersion. It doesn't mean anything else. And so Philip's going down with him because this guy is being totally submerged under the water. And then, of course, the very next verse says, then they both came up out of the water. And so this is just it's an easy spot to just point out and make very clear that any other form of baptism, whether you're talking about a sprinkling or a pouring or some other kind of form, it doesn't fit with what the Bible is describing whenever it's talking about baptism. Not just in this place, but every time baptism is talked about. I wanted to just say something about the fact that Philip doesn't use miracles here with the eunuch. You know, when Philip was back in Samaria, he was doing miracles, wasn't he? Those people are amazed at the miracles that he's doing. And maybe when we come here to the eunuch, we would kind of wonder, well, why did he stop doing miracles? Why is he not doing miracles? And I'll just pitch that to you. Why doesn't Philip do miracles for the eunuch on this occasion? There we go. This is a guy who already believes. We noted earlier in the text that this man had been to Jerusalem to worship, so it's very likely he was a proselyte to the Jewish faith. He's already a believer in God. On top of that, he's reading the Scriptures, and there's no evidence here that says he doesn't believe it. The only problem is he just doesn't understand it. And so in this particular instance, miracles just weren't necessary because the eunuch was already a believer in the message. The purpose of the miracles, once again, was to validate the messenger that was speaking that message and to reinforce that what this man is saying really is from God. The eunuch doesn't have that trouble with Philip. He accepts Philip as being someone who is sent from God. In fact, you have to kind of wonder if maybe the eunuch maybe had some thoughts, when Philip came up to him and started asking him about what he was reading, if maybe the eunuch started to wonder, where'd this guy come from? How did he know to come to me? How did he know to even ask me about what it is that I was reading? What exactly is going on here? You have to wonder if maybe he started to even recognize a little bit of the providence of God at play here in his life. This guy is a believer, and so miracles just weren't really even necessary for the purposes of what was going on here. I want to say, back up from verse 35, let me just back up to there as well, where it says that Philip opened up his mouth, and beginning with this scripture, he told him the good news about Jesus. I want to state from that verse that preaching Jesus is sufficient for a person's obedience to the gospel. I'm making that point here because Philip does not enroll this guy in a 36-lesson correspondence course so that this guy will know everything about the church, and this guy will know everything about the worship of the church, and this guy will know, the organization of the church, and every single issue of morality that God has legislated. Philip doesn't do that. Because what this guy needs is he simply needs to know who Jesus is, he needs to know what Jesus has done, and he needs to know how to respond to what Jesus has done. And that is sufficient for this man to obey the gospel. And I want to say that to us and to remind us that when we are studying with folks, have opportunities to have discussions with folks, it is not always going to be necessary for us to explain to them and help them to understand everything about everything in the whole big Bible right up front. In fact, many times when we get off onto all these other issues that the Bible does talk about and are important, we can end up diluting the main thing, and that is helping them to understand their need for salvation and how to respond to that salvation accordingly. Those other things, they'll come in due time. I think that's even kind of the order that Jesus laid out. Do you remember when we studied the Great Commission at the end of Mark? Jesus says you're going to help these people, and they're going to be baptized. They need to be believers in me so they can be baptized. And then you're going to teach them to observe all that I've commanded you. There's some teaching at the beginning. They're going to become Christians. And then there's going to be a whole lot more teaching that's going to come after that. I have no doubt that this Ethiopian man continued in his studies and learning about what he needed to learn. As far as, what happened to him after this, how did he get all the additional information that he needed in order to, know everything else about, New Testament Christianity? I don't know, but I am confident that the Lord took care of that. And you and I, we need to be about the business of preaching Jesus. Yes, that may mean we need to try to help folks unpack some wrong ideas. Maybe they have some wrong ideas about salvation or some wrong things that are hindering them from getting there. But it's not necessary for us to try and teach everybody everything from Genesis to Revelation in order to help them to become a Christian. Philip preached Jesus to this man, and he was successfully made a Christian because of that. I want to say something about the man's rejoicing at the end of verse 39. Certainly this man is rejoicing because he now understands, and because he's a Christian. He has confidence that all of his sins are washed away. He's in Christ and all of those wonderful blessings. But I want to also add here that maybe one of the other things that this man is beginning to understand, and maybe even this is something that Philip maybe even explained to him, is that because he is a Christian now, some of the things that were preventing him from being able to come to God in the fullest sense prior to this, those obstacles are no more. I'm thinking particularly about the fact that he was a eunuch. In Deuteronomy, the 23rd chapter, and in verse 1, if a man was a eunuch, he was prohibited from being a part of the assembly of the Lord. Now, he could go to the temple, and he could be a part of kind of maybe that outer court of the Gentiles maybe, but he would not be allowed to proceed any further than that. There was a hindrance there. His physical makeup prevented him from coming and partaking with the Jews and being a part of that assembly and being really a part of God's people in the fullest sense. But Isaiah, in Isaiah the 56th chapter, spoke that a day would come in the time of the Messiah when things like being a eunuch, amongst other things, would no longer hinder a person from coming to the Lord in the fullest, truest sense. In fact, I want to read a couple of those verses in Isaiah chapter 56 and in verses 3 through 7. Notice what's said there, Isaiah 56, beginning in verse 3. Isaiah says, "Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord say that the Lord will surely separate me from His people. And let not the eunuch say, behold, I'm a dry tree. You know, hey, I'm not really a part of God's people. I really can't be fruitful and productive, and I can't be everything that God wants me to be because I've got this thing, whether it's the fact that I'm a eunuch or the fact that I'm a foreigner. I can't truly be a part of God's people because of those things." God says to them, verse 4, "To the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast to my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off." And then he says, "To the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord, to minister to Him, to love the name of the Lord, to be His servants, everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it and holds fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain, and I will make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house," here's the kicker, "my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." And so we've been talking on Sunday nights the last couple of weeks in Romans about how Gentiles are no longer, because of what Jesus has done through the gospel, Gentiles are not hindered from coming to the Lord. And in this particular case, eunuchs, foreigners, whatever other thing that you might describe about yourself, or even that the Old Testament maybe even legislated, that maybe would have kind of prevented you from fully coming to the Lord and really being a part of God's people, no more. In Christ Jesus, all people get to come to the holy mountain. And all people get to say, I am a part of the family of God. I am accepted. God accepts me. My brothers and my sisters, they accept me as well. And I think about that. I think about, I don't know what point the eunuch would have fully started to understand all that. Maybe he had that copy of the scroll of Isaiah 53. And maybe he just kept on reading. And maybe he got to what we know as Isaiah 56. And he read those passages, and man, just maybe would have just caused such excitement and elation for this man. But when this guy came up out of the water, he is rejoicing for a number of different reasons. He really is a Christian and really is a part of God's people at this point. Other thoughts about the eunuch or other things? Tom? That's right. Let me go ahead and just repeat that for the folks who wasn't able to hear. Tom's made the point that there are lots of. He even heard a denominational preacher, did you say, was saying that there's these passages that talk about how God welcomes all people. That means that even if you are living in sin, whether it's homosexuality or whatever it may be, that means that you can be a part of God's family anyway and continue in your sin. Maybe one of the things that we want to say about that, especially when you read a passage like Isaiah chapter 56. Is that passage makes clear, yeah, you can be a part of God's family, and it is open to all people, but God says several things in that passage about if you'll do this, if you'll live according to my will, if you'll observe my commandments, if you'll be involved in these things that I want you to be involved in. Like that song says, just as I am. Yes, we can come to God just as we are, but He doesn't want us to stay just as we are. He wants to mold us and shape us and make us better. All right, what else do you want to say? Yeah. Yeah. Tom's made the observation, and it is a good thing to think about, that, the eunuch, of course, when he leaves here, he's heading back to Ethiopia. When he goes home, at least as best we can tell, at least at this point in time, there's not a local Church of Christ there in Ethiopia. That's not to say that there wasn't, but more than likely there probably was not yet at that particular point in time. And so we do wonder about, what did he do and what did God provide for him? And I don't know all the answers to all of that, at least not immediately. I'm convinced God would have saw to it. The fact that God saw to it that this man would have someone to teach him and help him to become a Christian says to me, God's going to give that man everything else that he needs in order to make it to heaven. And so we can be confident that whatever other resources he would need, whether that's other teachers and other Christians that would migrate to that area and come to town and help to begin that process, certainly, as Tom pointed out, I don't have any doubt this guy, the fact that he's on his way rejoicing says to me, the next person he ran into, he was probably going to try to talk to them about Jesus Christ. And whatever family or whatever other friends that he had back in Ethiopia, he'd have been teaching those folks and trying to help them come to the same realizations and conclusions that he had come to about Christ as well. Anybody want to offer anything else on that particular end? Daddy?
Well, I believe I seen one time on a historical type program. I believe it's the Coptic Church that goes way back into history. And there certainly be evidence that if the eunuch was the one, he certainly got on fire because it goes way back in history.
Yeah.
So it must have been a lot of people converted because a lot of good things happened there.
That's right, and actually there are copies of, maybe not full copies, but there are certainly manuscripts of Coptic versions of the Bible that date really, really old as well. And that would probably be evidence that, if nothing else, that Ethiopian guy got busy. And it certainly is possible for a person, even today, as crazy as it may seem to us living here in, central Kentucky in the middle of the Bible Belt, but there are places that a person could go, even here in the United States, and you could be the only Christian. You'd be the only person who's trying to follow Jesus Christ. And, what do you do? Well, I guess maybe you would attempt to, try to find some place that you could go and join yourself with that would be within some kind of a driving distance, but maybe that's not even possible. Well, to me, it seems like the next logical thing to do is I'm going to get busy working in the place where I'm at, and I'm going to be trying to help others find Jesus and help them to know the Lord. How long a person sticks with that until they, have to make some other decisions, I don't know. But this guy here, I feel very confident in saying this guy would have hit the ground running. Other thoughts about the eunuch? Carol. Yeah. Yep. That's right. That's right. We noted last week about how there probably would have at least one other person with him in the chariot, because he commands the chariot to stop. So that's evidence that someone was driving the chariot. Could have been a couple of folks. Could have been even more than that. And you can't be a church with just one person, but you can start a church with two people, and it's got to start somewhere. And so yes, there's all kinds of possibilities and explanations. And the neat thing to think about though now is, if you were building a map in your mind of the expansion of Christianity, we began in Jerusalem with that one little dot there. Persecution happens, and we're starting to swell that dot. We're going into Samaria. We're going into the other parts of Judea. Now we've got this guy who's come from Ethiopia. He's here on the Gaza Strip. He's now going to take that all the way down into a whole new continent now. He's taking that back to Africa now. So now we got the gospel on at least 2 continents. We are seeing the gospel. This is how it works. This is how it spreads. It goes from one person to another, just people teaching people. And that chain of teaching continues on even today for us in the 21st century, sitting here in the United States of America. Other thoughts about the eunuch? Dad? Yeah.
Anyway, from there, there's churches all over the country of Columbia now, because this one fellow learned the truth. He was in Florida, in the United States, and went back, and there's churches all over.
Yeah, Dad's made the comment for those who couldn't hear, and this is the other really very likely possibility, is that just some other people who are already Christians kind of came and helped in getting some things started. I know of some brethren personally who have relocated. They have taken their families and have relocated to completely different continents of the world to help areas where churches did not exist. And they've dedicated, a block of time of their life, whether that's the commitment of a few months or a few years, to help kind of get things started. It's a place where there'd only be like maybe one Christian or one Christian family, and so they would come in to help be of assistance there and to help get things going. For all we know, there may have been some brethren that would have came from Jerusalem and some of these surrounding areas that would have maybe decided, hey, let's follow up with that guy and let's go check and see what's going on down there and see how we might be able to be of help. Lots of possibilities. What's mentioned there in verse 39 about how when they came up out of the water that the Spirit of the Lord carried Philip away. There's always a question about that, and that is, well, number one, just what does that mean? Is that describing a miracle? Like Philip just zapped out of there and just dropped in another place entirely? Or when it says the Spirit of the Lord carried him away, does it just mean that the Spirit gave him directions and then Philip went, on his own 2 feet? And I'm going to tell you, for me, I don't know. This is kind of like in Luke, the 4th chapter, whenever, the crowds were coming upon Jesus and, backing him up against, they're ready to throw him off of a cliff. And then the text just says, and then Jesus passed through their midst and left. Well, what happened there? Did Jesus just literally just walk right through the crowd, or was there something miraculous that took place there to, get him evacuated from the area? And once again, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. Has anybody got any concrete convictions about that as to what's happening here? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's certainly possible. Regardless, it is at the Spirit's direction. Either way you take that, the Spirit is the one directing him where he's going to go. He finds himself at Azotus, it says, which is actually the ancient Philistine city of Ashdod. And so Philip's kind of going into an area that would have been a very, or at least had a history of being a very Gentile and very pagan land. And we're not going to see from Philip again until Acts the 21st chapter. And we'll get kind of some brief mentions of him in that chapter. But this is Philip. He's been brought across the stage by Luke. We learned some great things about him, and now he's going to walk right off of the stage. We're going to look in this next chapter at the story in the conversion of Saul. But I wanted to say this kind of in transitioning from chapter 8 to chapter 9. I read this article that was written by someone. I don't know if this guy's a member of the church or a member of some denomination, but it really got to me thinking here. One author said that the eunuch's conversion is better than Saul's conversion. And he went on to explain the reason for that is because unlike Saul, the eunuch did not have any supernatural appearance from Jesus. Did not have any kind of supernatural manifestations from the Lord or anything miraculous happened for him. And yet, despite not having those things, he believed and became a Christian. And he became that from simply a careful reading and understanding of the Scriptures. And I got to thinking about that. For the longest time, I've often thought, man, Saul's conversion is the most amazing conversion in the whole Bible. But there's something to be said in contrasting the eunuch to what we're going to read about with Saul. Saul's conversion is amazing, and we'll talk a lot about that here in chapter 9. But it is amazing for us to think about that you and I, we're never going to be converted in the way that Saul was converted. You and I ain't going to be getting a bright light and Jesus appearing to us on the road and speaking to us in an audible fashion that way. We're not going to get that. But you know what? We can get the exact same thing that the eunuch got. And that is, we can sit down with the Bible and maybe even just sit down with another person and study that Bible. And we can come to some conclusions about who Jesus is and what we need to do in response to Him. And that is what makes the eunuch's conversion just so remarkable, because the way he was saved is the exact same way that we're going to be saved. Now, certainly what happens with Saul here, there's certainly some important reasons for him getting this miraculous appearance of Jesus happening to him, and we want to understand about that. Before we close the book or close the chapter on chapter 8, final thoughts on Philip the eunuch or anything in chapter 8? Yep. Yeah. Yeah, Mickey. I think Mickey made the comment last week that his time spent in Jerusalem would have. You'd have to think there would have been some impact of encountering Christianity maybe for the very first time and being privy to that and hearing things about this Jesus fellow and then finally here Philip's able to help connect all the dots that need to be dotted together. What else? Go ahead, Glenn. He's talked enough. Yeah.
And we find he's working really hard to find out about God and what he's supposed to do. And by the fact that God's providence happens here, reminds me of James 1, where he tells us that if we lack wisdom, God will give us.
Yeah.
He had the scriptures, and he's like the Bereans. He's studying them and proving what he has by the scriptures. He just didn't understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just think it's
yeah.
We shouldn't expect a miracle like some in our lives today. We have to do the same way the Bereans did.
Yeah. That's right. And Glenn's made the point that this is a great connection to James chapter 1, verse 5, about if any man lacks wisdom, let him pray to God, and God will supply that in abundance. And you're right, the way that God's going to give that to us, it may be different from person to person. It may be through listening to a sermon. It may be through hearing something on the radio or randomly coming across something on my internet feed and it gets me to thinking. There's all kinds of ways in which God accomplishes that. And it does. It speaks to the power of God's providence, and we don't ever want to minimize that. It speaks to as well how God answers those kinds of prayers and how He honors sincere people. People who are truly sincere. And sometimes that word gets thrown around today and applied to people who actually aren't sincere. Truly sincere people, when they're presented with the truth, are people who are going to then act upon that truth. If the eunuch had been presented with the truth by Philip and then said, well, Philip, that's really interesting, but I don't agree with that, and I don't think I need to be baptized in order to be in a right relationship with God, then the moment the eunuch says that, his sincerity goes right out the window. He's no longer being a sincere person. He's no longer acting in accordance with what the truth really is. But God is amazingly good at putting the right people in the right place at the right time so that sincere people can have the opportunity that they need in order to see their sincerity through all the way through to obedience to His gospel. Daddy. Yeah.
He actually gets married and has daughters. And he guides them in the way of the Lord because they're all prophesying.
Yeah, that's right. Kind of make a note there at the end of verse 40. Maybe just put a note for chapter 21, verse 8, because that will be the next time we meet Philip. And he does seem to be in the same spot, whether that means he stayed in Caesarea the entirety of the time between here and chapter 21. Don't entirely know, but there'll be some things we'll be able to kind of conclude about Philip by the time that we get there several years later. Well, chapter 9 is the first telling of the conversion of this guy named Saul. And it really is one of the most amazing conversion stories in all the Bible. And one of the reasons we do want to emphasize that is because I think God emphasizes that. Because we don't just get this conversion story told once. We get it told 3 times in the book of Acts. We'll get it again in chapter 22, and then again in chapter 26. Not to mention Paul in some of his writings in Galatians 1, 1 Corinthians 15, in his letters to Timothy. He will talk often about his conversion and some of the things that was going on in his life, things that were going through his mind, where he was just as a person. And so there's a lot of emphasis on Saul's conversion, and with good reason, because this guy maybe does make the most dramatic turnaround of anybody, maybe in history, certainly in the New Testament. Because everything that we've learned about this guy up to this point says this guy is the villain of the Bible. I mean, there are some bad people in the Bible, but man, this guy is just sinister. He is the one who is kind of he's the face of this persecution being led against Christianity, against the church, against Christians. We're going to see here the word that's used in verse 2, the way. This guy is the biggest bad guy in the New Testament. And so the last thing that we would expect is that this guy's going to do a complete 180-degree turn, and he's going to end up, it's not just that he quits being the bad guy, he's actually going to align himself with the forces of righteousness and good and where he needs to be. And that's what makes it so amazing. And this conversion story, of course, will play just a major part in the defenses that Paul is going to have to make for a lot of the remaining chapters in the back part of Acts. So we're going to keep coming back to this story. And we may not even cover every single detail of the story tonight because we're going to end up talking about it again several other times before we're finished with Acts. Let's just read a couple of verses here and set the scene for Acts chapter 9. And so Acts chapter 9 in verse number 1. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest, and he asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Let's just reacquaint ourselves with what's going on here. This really is just resuming what Luke started to talk about at the very beginning of chapter 8. Really, Acts chapter 9, verse 1 is just a continuation of Acts chapter 8, verse 3. In a lot of ways, the book of Acts, I always think of it kind of like, if you've ever watched the Star Wars movies. In the Star Wars movies, there's lots of characters that are all doing different things in all their different little universes. And so from time to time, you'll see the screen just kind of pan this way, and it goes, all right, so we're going to go from the Dagobah system, and now we're going to see what's going on over here on the Death Star. And we're going to finish up looking at the Death Star, and the screen's going to pan, and we're going to see what's going on over here on the Millennium Falcon. And there's all these characters and all these things going on, and of course they all then culminate at the end. Acts is like that in a lot of ways, because it's not just the story of just one guy. You know, when you're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you're following Jesus. We're seeing what Jesus is doing. We're following where He's going, and even when people are talking, they're talking about Jesus, and so it's always coming back to Jesus. In the book of Acts, this isn't the Acts of Peter, or even just the Acts of Paul. It's the Acts of the Apostles. It's the Acts of these early Christians. So there's lots going on in lots of different places. And we've got to visit in a lot of different locations just in these first 8 chapters thus far. And we've got to see that lots of people are playing a part and playing a hand in the spread of Christianity in the beginning. And so Saul, we pick up here. Saul, we find out, back in Jerusalem, is continuing on in the rampage that had began just a short time ago. The wording that's used here in verse 1 is extremely strong language. Look at the word that's used there. He was still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. That term breathing there, this would be like us when we say that someone eats, sleeps, and breathes football. What do we mean by that? We mean that person is just all about football. It's all they think about. Everything in their mind and in their world is, or they read about football, and they're practicing for football, and they watch football, and they participate in football. In this particular case, we've got a guy like that who's eating, sleeping, and breathing something, but it isn't something wholesome and good. It isn't football. He's eating, sleeping, and breathing threats and murder against Christians. It's all this guy thought about. He was singularly focused in stamping out Christianity. And I do want to draw our attention there to verse 2 when it says there, finding any belonging to the way. I love that description of Christianity there. Why is that an appropriate term to describe Christianity? All right, it was the way that it was the way of the time, certainly, and certainly the progression of the Old Testament had brought us to that moment. What's another reason why the way is an appropriate designation for the Christian life? All right, let me grab 2 things there. First of all, Carolyn, what'd you say? All right, love that. It's singular. It's not the ways, it's the way. That, of course, reminds us of what Jesus said about Himself. In John chapter 14 and in verse 6, I am the way and the truth and the life. In some ways, you could even describe Christianity in any of those 3 descriptions that Jesus used there. Daddy, what'd you say? It's a way of life. It's everything that a person ought to be. It should be an all-consuming way of thinking and doing things. And so I love that. And evidently, that was a term that circulated even in the first century for describing Christianity. And I like that. We use the term Christianity today, and for all we know, that wasn't even a word back then. And so their description was the way. Notice that he's breathing these threats and murder and all this kind of stuff, not just against men, but Luke points out men and women. Luke has kind of went out of his way on several different occasions in the book of Acts to point out how men and women are receiving the message of the gospel, and men and women are responding to the gospel. But Luke also points out that those very same people, men and women, are on the receiving end of some of the pain and the suffering that goes along with persecution on account of the gospel. And so men and women are suffering, and certainly that, even though children aren't mentioned there, children would have been suffering as well. Kids may not have been dragged to jail and murdered and that kind of stuff, but if mom and daddy's getting dragged off, then that means kids are suffering as well. Lots of people who identified as Christians were suffering at the hands of this man. Saul goes, verses 1 and 2 tells us, he goes to the high priest, and it says that he asks for letters to the synagogues at Damascus. Several things to point out there. First of all, at this point in history, Caesar, Julius Caesar, and then also even Augustus as well, had actually granted the high priest and the Sanhedrin jurisdiction over Jews who lived in foreign cities. You didn't just have control over jurisdiction over Jews that lived in Jerusalem, but they actually even had jurisdiction over Jews who moved away and lived in other places. And so the idea here of asking for some papers so that we can then bring these people here, it actually was something that the Roman government had actually granted that level of authority to the Sanhedrin Council to be able to do. The letters to the synagogue really would have served kind of like a warrant, like an arrest warrant for us today. It would authorize Saul and whatever other, maybe he has some temple guards and some other men that are accompanying him. It would allow them and give them the right to bind these people that they deem to be heretics, these people that they deem to be blasphemers. And we need to remember that. Saul really believed that what these Christians were doing was heresy. It was blasphemy. And according to the Old Testament, what did you do with people who blaspheme God? They were to be put to death. And so this once again speaks of the sincerity with which Saul himself possesses. He's not just running around killing people like some just, serial killer who just randomly just shoots people for nothing. No, he's specifically hunting down people who he believes are blaspheming God. These people are professing to follow someone who calls himself the very Son of God, and I don't believe that man is the Son of God. And so in that sense, he's operating in sincerity. He believes he's doing the right thing, that God wants him to do that. Over in Acts chapter 23, when we get there, Paul at that point is going to say, I have lived in all good conscience to this present day. So these things that he's doing here in verses 1 and 2, he believes he's doing the right thing. He is not just trying to, to just be evil and, hack God off and just be a nuisance to society. In a lot of ways, I've used this description before, when we think about Saul at this point in his life, we need to think terrorist. We need to think Osama bin Laden or any of those other, well-known terrorists in our current time, because that's the type of guy that this is. And people like Osama bin Laden and those other terrorists that have even existed in our day and time, they believed they were doing what was right. They weren't just trying to kill people. They believed that they were obeying what Allah wanted them to do. They believed that that was what their religion guided them and directed them to do. Saul is acting in that same way. I want us to note the fact that he goes to Damascus, verse 2. I'm going to put a map here for folks watching at home. Damascus is not next door to Jerusalem. Damascus is 150, 175 miles away, which means we're talking about a place that would take, in that time, it'd take you like a week to get there. Now, what does that say to you about the strength and the animosity with which Saul and others had towards Christians, where we are willing to travel a week away from where we are back then, 150, 175 miles away. I mean, that's like, it'd be like a whole other country to us. We're willing to travel that long of a distance to go and round these folks up, grab these folks, bind them hand and foot, load them on our, whatever, chariot or a cart or however we're going to get them back. We're going to bring them all the way back to Jerusalem to answer these charges before the council. That just says something about the contempt with which Saul and really just the rest of the Jewish rulers at that time had for Christians, that he's willing to go that far. It's been stated before, some historical records even outside of the Bible, that Damascus actually had the largest Jewish population in Palestine besides Jerusalem. And so, if you're looking to get rid of Christians, if you're looking to get rid of Jews who have converted to Christianity, all right, Jerusalem would be the place to start. But if you're kind of scratching your head, okay, where's the next place we could go to potentially find some of these rats who have ran off? Damascus probably would be the next wise place to go. And so we're going to travel all the way there to get those folks. Josephus actually records that there was more than 10,000 Jews living in Damascus at a particular given time. Notice as well that he asked for letters to the synagogues at Damascus. I'm pointing this out. I've pointed it out several times, and I'm going to keep pointing it out. Evidently, Christians were continuing to meet in synagogues. If you got Jews that become Christians, all right, where are they used to assembling and meeting to worship God? Well, they're used to going to synagogues. And so, just kind of makes sense. Well, let's just keep meeting in synagogues, but now we're going to worship with better knowledge and better understanding. We have an understanding of who Christ is and what He's done for us, but it's just a handy location. And Saul knows, if I can go to a synagogue, more than likely, probably going to find some Christians there. Maybe everybody there isn't a Christian, but there's probably going to be a lot of folks there that are Christians. And I'm pointing this out once again because I want us to see that there was not just an immediate break from Judaism to Christianity for a lot of folks in the first century. For a lot of folks, it was kind of a gradual weaning away from Judaism and the practices and some of the other customs that went along with Judaism. And meeting in a synagogue evidently was still one of those things. And that just says to me that God allowed these people time to grow at the pace that they needed to get to the point where they can come to some better realizations about some things. I talked about back in chapter 7, I believe that Stephen probably was a little ahead of the game than a lot of other folks. I think Stephen did see a very distinct separation between Judaism and Christianity. But a lot of other folks are still learning and still trying to figure some things out. What else do you want to say about those first two verses? Daddy and then Tom.
Well, I mean, when you had several Jews and synagogue being converted, generally it's on Sabbath. Saturday, they didn't meet on the rest of the week.
Yeah.
They had access to the building, but on the rest of the week.
Yeah. Dad just made the point for those who couldn't hear. Those who are still practicing strict Judaism, they're going to be meeting on the synagogue on Sabbath day. It'd be Saturday, and as far as we would know, Sunday maybe the building facility's not even being utilized, at least not for the same purposes that it would be on the Sabbath day. And so, it just makes sense to make use of that. What else, Tom? Yeah. 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 There's a bunch of good points there, and we're going to come back to at least one of those next week. But I will just close with the first point that you made there about one of the things that God sees in Saul is the fervency and the zeal with which he is acting. And what God sees is, man, that's a sincere guy. If we can just get him the right information, that guy will be a powerful tool and instrument for me. And that's exactly what's going to happen. The Lord's got big plans for Saul. And so next week we'll actually get into the actual encounter that he has there on the road to Damascus, and then what he does in order to become a Christian. Appreciate everybody's good thoughts and attention this evening, and look forward to picking up there in verse 3 next week.